If you didn't have the opportunity to catch last week's sermon, the first sermon on perspectives on suffering, I hope that you'll hop onto our website and you will watch that. That sermon was the introduction to our series, Perspectives on Suffering, and I encourage you to check it out because the material that we are covering today really builds out of what we looked at last week. So last week we looked at the prologue of Job, the Job 1 and 2. And we asked this question: does God have to sign off on every single bad thing that happens on planet Earth? And if so, what kind of a God must that be? Or is there another way of looking at it? And so today we are continuing looking at these perspectives on suffering. And we're using that word perspectives because these are not airtight explanations. These are perspectives. And we want to remember that because if this unravels something for you and you are in a time when you're just trying to cope and survive and it feels like life is in crisis mode, you have permission to take whatever I have said that is unraveling things for you and just put it on the shelf. Say, that's a perspective. I'll come back to it at a different time when life is more steady and I feel like I can manage. I'll come back to this perspective later. Let's start out with a true story. This is a story that Jessica Kelley tells in her book, fabulous book, Lord Willing. So Ian and Jessica Kelley had just moved into a beautiful new home in the suburbs of Atlanta. Jessica was 29 at the time. They had two beautiful children. Henry was 4 years old, and Mary was 1 year old. They had a plush lawn, granite countertops. They were living the dream. Henry loved to finger paint and color, sculpt, Play-Doh, spend time with his grandpa, crunch fallen leaves in the backyard. The winter of 2012 was really germ city for Henry. He just had this long lineup of infections, colds, sinus problems, and so as the winter dragged on, Henry kept dealing with reoccurring ear infections, which of course led to 4-year-old crankiness. And the spring didn't help anything. Henry was breathing through his mouth quite a lot because his sinuses were just so clogged, and he was having frequent fevers. He had to go on antibiotics over and over for his ear infections. And it seemed like irritability and tantrums just went along with all of it. And so as spring turned into summer, Henry began to lose his appetite. He wasn't sleeping well, and sometimes his hands would become shaky, almost like he had low blood sugar. He started to have more frequent stomach bugs, and Ian and Jessica felt like they just couldn't catch a break. The doctors said that Henry probably needed an ear surgery. So Henry had ear surgery. He got ear tubes, but the ear tubes didn't help. Henry was becoming more irritable, more fatigued, even less interested in eating. Jessica and Ian didn't want to admit to themselves the fear that was beginning to claw at their heart. Just this growing sense of dread, like something is wrong. Henry's shakes and trembles weren't getting any better. They were becoming worse. When Jessica called the doctors and told them that things were worse after the surgery, The doctors scrambled to accommodate them. The doctor ordered more blood work and an MRI. Uh, they were wondering, is it an autoimmune disorder? Is it a pinched nerve? The doctor arranged for a neurologist appointment the following week. And so that week, as they waited for these appointments, Jessica and Ian made a list of every symptom and cause that they could think of. Jessica had hypertension in her third trimester. Henry was a little jaundiced as a baby, anything that they could think of. And meanwhile, that week, Henry was getting worse. He was napping a lot. He was trembling more at the playground instead of even being able to climb the stairs. When he came to a step, he just groaned and gave up, like he couldn't. And when they got home that evening from the park, Henry peed his pants. His legs were beginning to shake when he walked. His right leg was beginning to drag. Jessica recalls the moment that the neurosurgeon finally told her, Henry has a bilateral tumor in the frontal lobe of his brain. It's extremely large and vascular. There's fluid trapped and building in his skull. And this is what's making him anxious, clingy, sleepless, irrational. It's what is killing his appetite and causing incontinence and the shaking. Well, Jessica had no idea what to do with this information other than to blame herself. And so waves of blame began to swell. She had always believed that anything that Henry experienced could be traced back to her success or failure as a mother. So, what caused this tumor? Where did it come from? Was it that super stressful day at work when I was pregnant, she wondered? Or was it some kind of a sneaky toxin that I ate or touched or breathed while I was pregnant? What could I have done to prevent this? Could I have caught this sooner? And how did I miss something so massive? The questions of self-blame just rained down. And just before Jessica was completely submerged in an ocean of shame, her phone dinged. It was a text from her brother. And it simply said, Jesus wanted me to tell you this isn't your fault. Jesus wanted me to tell you this isn't your fault. And Jessica says, I had to pause to inhale and to exhale and weep. She says, I was amazed at how much God cared for me and even for my overburdened conscience. Now, that's not the end of Jessica's brutally painful story about Henry. And I hope I've whet your appetite to read her book. But that particular moment captures something that so many of us experience when bad things happen. It's self-blame, it's shame. When we encounter suffering, tragedy, crisis, trauma, we instinctively say, this must be my fault. What could I have done to prevent this? Like, if only I didn't sleep in today, or if only I answered the phone, or if only I let my child take his seatbelt off. Just a myriad of scenarios and questions. I must have done something wrong. What did I do to cause this? What didn't I do to cause this? What did I miss? And we drown in oceans of self-blame. Even after we find out that there are all kinds of other reasons for whatever it is that happened, we find reasons to blame ourselves. It's been observed over and over that survivors of traumatic events and tragedies often blame themselves and wrestle with guilt and shame. And we blame ourselves not only for what happened, but then we blame ourselves for the disruption that it causes in everyone else's life around us. And so it just cycles on and on and on. Self-blame, shame. Now, obviously, if you know that you willfully did something to cause someone else's suffering or your own suffering, if you know there's a direct cause and effect link to something you chose to do, then obviously you need to own your actions and take responsibility and do what you can to reconcile and alleviate the suffering. That much is obvious, but life is full of situations of suffering that cause us to blame ourselves, even though we have no idea what exactly we did wrong, but we're still blaming ourselves. It's not like shame, self-blame only pop up when bad things happen. They were there all along. Brene Brown calls shame the never good enough emotion, one of the most primitive and universal emotions on the planet. This elusive feeling, you have no idea how to be good enough. You only know that you aren't good enough. Lewis Smedes says shame is constantly reinforced by our culture that says you aren't blank enough, tall enough, thin enough, strong enough, smart enough, wealthy enough. You fill in the blank. He says it's reinforced by graceless religion, where following the letter of the law with all of its customs and taboos determines your blessings and your curses. And he says that shame is reinforced by unaccepting parents who are impossible to please. He says so it's the reason that you go to an annual review at work or some kind of an evaluation, and it doesn't matter that your boss says 17 things about you that are positive, things that you're doing well. When your boss says that one thing, that one growing edge, that thing that you hear is a bad thing, that's your takeaway. And you can't stop thinking about that one bad thing. And it's not simply, oh, I did something bad. It morphs into, I am bad. So when life goes into crisis mode, many people tend to go inward. They they either isolate themselves or their circumstances isolate them, and the accuser's voice becomes even louder. You may remember the accuser, what the accuser says from last week, the prologue of Job. There aren't as many other voices pushing back, saying something else. The accuser wants us to believe what he accuses God of. So, going back to Job chapter 1, verse 9 through 11, Satan, the accuser, says God rules this world with fear rather than love. He says there's really no such thing as free choice because God controls humans by blessing them if they please him and cursing them if they offend him. And so it's kind of like holiness becomes an illusion that people only obey God because they want God's protection. And so obedience just turns into this, it's working the system, it's a self-serving bargain. Uh, and so it paints this picture of God who rules the world with raw power, with fear, with manipulation. And so if the accuser can get you to believe what he accuses God of, well, let's back up. If he can simply start you down that road by getting you to say, well, this must be my fault. I must have failed. I could have done something to prevent this. Then the accuser has you only one step away from believing in an angry God that rules with fear and raw power and manipulation. So as we look at Job's story, it's important to pay attention to which characters in the story are arguing for the same picture of God that Satan paints. So let's look at the story. In the book of Job, after Job's children die, after his servants are killed, his livestock is burned up, his body is covered in terrible sores that run with pus, they're clogged with dirt, infested with worms, Job has these three friends that come from the south, the east, and the north to join Job in his grieving and his suffering. So we've got Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And initially, they seem like good friends. They tear their robes, they throw dust on their heads, which is like an ancient picture of intense suffering with someone. They weep aloud with Job, and they sit with Job all day and all night for an entire week. This is Job chapter 2, verse 11 through 13. They just sit there with him without saying anything. I mean, talk about solidarity and empathy and entering into someone else's experience. But it's interesting, they can't keep it up. Eventually, they show their true colors. They're steeped in a culture that says that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. And so when bad things happen, they say, well, you must have messed up. Like you've offended the God or the gods. So, Job, you are to blame in this situation. Job, you are on trial. Now, going back to last week, remember that stack of books from the ancient Near East, Barnes and Noble? We talked about this last week, how there's all kinds of parallels between the book of Job and all of these other books that had been written around the similar time in that area. So Job's friends function as representatives of the traditional view of the ancient Near East. The parallels and the echoes are striking, and one of the hallmarks of the righteous sufferer theme that all of these books are dealing with is that the sufferer is on trial. It's like the sufferer did something wrong. There's a scholar and professor of ancient Near East literature, Tzvi Abusch, and he's cataloged all of this writing that we're looking at. And here's how he sums it up, the ancient Near East thought. It would say, okay, if you have suffered or continually suffer loss of barley, silver, slaves, cattle, horses, sheep, dogs, pigs, if you suffer heartbreak, if no one listens to you or complies, if you call but no one answers, if you experience weakness, paralysis, epilepsy, if your limbs hang limp, if you have anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, loss of appetite, or memory trouble, then that woman or that man has the wrath of the god or the goddess on them. Their god or their goddess is angry with them. That is how he sums up the message of all of this ancient Near East literature. So it would be this idea, Job, you did something wrong. Job, you are to blame. Almost as if Job is arguing not only with his friends, but with this stack of books. So here's a sketch of the way the conversation goes between Job and his friends. Job says, why is this happening? He says, I wish I was dead. Like, why did I not perish at birth? Now I would be lying down in peace. Starting out in Job chapter 3. His friend Eliphaz says, Job, pray for a miracle. God is correcting you. Blessed is the one whom God corrects. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, for he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. You may remember from last week, like he gives and he takes away. That's the thought of the day, at least. Job says, I just wish God would kill me. What have I done to deserve this? The arrows of the Almighty are in me. Oh, that God would loose his hand and cut off my life. And then he has this question that he's going to ask all the way through. If I have sinned, what have I done? Well, Bildad says, God will restore you if you plead with him, Job. God doesn't reject the innocent. If you plead with the Almighty, he'll rouse himself and restore you. God doesn't reject the one who's blameless. Job comes back. He says, I am on trial, but God won't give me a hearing. Tell me what charges you have against me, God. I say to God, do not declare me guilty. Tell me what charges you have. Zophar says, Job, just confess. You'll be safe. If you put away the sin that is in your hand, you'll stand firm without fear. You'll be secure. You'll take rest in your safety. Job comes back. God has all the power and the wisdom. But once again, show me my offense and my sin. He says, though he slays me, yet I will hope in him. It's a reiteration of this same theme that he's been saying, thinking the Lord gives and the Lord takes, which God's going to address that. Eliphaz, Job, you've sinned. Just look at your situation. He says, all his days the wicked man suffers torment. The ruthless man through all the years stored up for him. Job, you are miserable comforters. And God is violent, but I am not. He rushes at me like a warrior. Yet my hands have been free of violence, and my prayer is pure. Bildad, Job, you are wicked. You brought this on yourself. Surely such is the dwelling of an evil man. Such is the place of one who does not know God. Job says, no, God has wronged me, but I am still committed to God. I know that God has wronged me. And he says, at the end of that chapter, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on earth. Job can't let go of his commitment to God. Zophar says, look at the fate of the wicked, Job. They lose all their wealth, their money, they're distressed. This is your situation. He says, such is the fate that God allows the wicked. This is the heritage appointed for them by God. Job says, that is not true. He says, the wicked live on. They grow old, they increase in power, their homes are safe and free from fear. Basically, he's saying, the rod of God is not on them. Like righteous people suffer, and it doesn't mean that they did something wrong. Eliphaz says, Job, your sins are endless. And he has this scathing list. You demanded security from your relatives. You stripped people of their clothing. You gave them no water. Gave no water to the weary. You withheld food from the hungry. You sent widows away empty-handed. You broke the strength of the orphan. Though you were a powerful land-owning man, you did all of this. Job says, look at how many wicked people oppress innocent poor people, and yet God does nothing. The groans of the dying rise from the city. The souls of the wounded cry out for help, but God charges no one with wrongdoing. Bildad, Job, if you are human, then you're impure. Humans are like worms to God. How can one born of woman be pure, a mortal who is but a maggot, a human being who is only a worm? Job says, who can understand God? God has denied me justice. He says, as surely as God lives, who's denied me justice, I will never admit that you are in the right. Till I die, I will not deny my integrity. And so Job continues. This is like his final defense. First he says, I miss God. I miss my old life. Oh, for the days when I was in my prime, and when God's intimate friendship blessed my house. When the Almighty was still with me and my children were around me. And then Job gives his final defense. I am innocent. I've not lusted or committed adultery. I've been honest in all regards. I've not denied justice to anyone, including my servants. I've not denied the desires of the poor, the orphan, or the widow. I've clothed the naked. I've not trusted in wealth. I've not worshipped false gods. I've not rejoiced in my enemy's downfall. I've not cursed my enemy. I've not turned away the stranger from my door. I've not been complicit in wrongdoing because of my fear of the crowd. I've not violated the land. It is amazing to compare Job 31 to the Sermon on the Mount. The way. There's a lot of parallels there. And that's where the conversation ends with Job's three friends. Outside of Elihu, who's a different conversation for a different time. Job's friends say, Job, you are ignorant. You might not know what you've done wrong, but you've done something wrong. And you've made God angry, and you better make it right. And Job, on the other hand, is insisting, guys, I'm not ignorant. I am innocent. You see, Job's friends all believe in an angry God who needs to be appeased. His friends believe that if Job will simply confess and pray and do the rituals and stop sinning and remove his wickedness, that he'll be restored and that his blessings and prosperity will be renewed. Have you ever heard anyone talk like Job's friends? I sure have. So, are they right? Well, God understands that the ultimate issue here is not the question, is Job to blame? Because this actually isn't a question about Job's character. This is actually a question about God's character, and it goes back to Satan's accusation of God, that God blesses the righteous and curses the wicked and rules with fear and power and manipulation. And so God finally appears at the end of the book, and God addresses Job and Job's friends. And so in the last page of the book of Job, here's what God says to Job's friends. He says, Job 42, he says, I'm angry with you because you have not spoken the truth about me, not about Job, about me, as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. So God basically says to these friends, you think I'm an angry God who needs appeased with rituals, and guess what? Well, I guess you're right that I'm angry, but I'm not angry with Job. I'm angry with you all for not speaking the truth about me. And you think that if I'm angry, that you need to go make sacrifices and burnt offerings like 7 bulls and 7 rams. So go ahead and do your ritual, but that's just more of the same because I'm not going to deal with you according to that folly. I like basically he's saying, I'm not going to act like the kind of God you think I am. That's what he's saying. My servant Job is going to pray for you because now Job understands a little bit more the kind of God I am because Job and God have had a conversation. And he says, of course, I'll accept his prayer. And of course, I won't act like the kind of God you think I am. So, right here in the oldest book of the Bible, many scholars say, we have God upending the thinking that says, well, it's as simple as the righteous are blessed and the wicked are cursed. We have God saying, it is not as simple as that. You remember the text that Jessica Kelley received from her brother that simply said, Jesus wanted me to tell you this isn't your fault. What if the next time you find yourself in the midst of suffering, in the midst of blaming yourself, or in the midst of transferring those thoughts to someone else and blaming them, even though you have no idea exactly what you did wrong or what someone else did wrong? What if you stopped? What if you stopped? Of course, it's hard for us to leave it there. Like, we hear that word stop, and it's like, well, what, how do I make sense of this? We say, well, if Job isn't to blame, then is God to blame? But we're going to have to save that for another week. So, stay tuned. What if you stopped blaming yourself?